What's going on, everybody? James here from Artificial Entertainment, and welcome to another Unreal Engine 5 AI tutorial. And today we're going to be looking at how to be able to set up the combat system and the different things you're going to need based off the different type of system you're going to want to set up. So let's go ahead, open up the project, and dive right in. So I have here the project that we've been working out of in the other videos. However, I did add a couple of props. This is a rifle and a sword, so this way I can show you guys how to be able to set up combat. Now in today's video, we're just going to be working on setting things up, not necessarily doing the whole melee and range combat systems. This way I can help break things down a little bit more and make things a little simpler, hopefully, in understanding how you would want to modify based off of what you need. Now the first thing to talk about is the different types of combat. Now, realistically, in this video series, we're going to be covering melee and range specifically, but you would use the same practices if you're trying to set up, for example, different melee stances for your AI to give them a different combat type. Same thing if you were doing a range combat system with magic and you wanted to have them be able to use different elements of magic. You would set up a combat enumeration to be able to choose between the different types of combat styles. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and the first thing we're going to make is going to be that enumeration. Now this just allows us to be able to choose between the different types of combat states within our behavior tree. So we're going to go into our AI assets folder and then the Enums folder where we made the base state enum in the first video. Now we're just going to right click, and we're going to go to blueprints, and then we're going to click on enumeration. We're going to take it and name it combat state enum, and then we'll double click and open her up. Now as you can see here, everything is empty when you make the enumerator, but we are going to be making a combat system again with just melee and range for this video. However, whenever you're making a combat enumeration to help choose between the different types, you're going to want to also make a default state, so this way you can help control the way the branches are going to work a little bit more effectively. So even though technically I'm going to only have 2 different types of combat, we're going to go ahead and add 3 enumerators. So up the option up here where it's a little plus sign, we're going to click this 3 times to give us 3 enumerations. Now the first one here, we're going to name this to none. This is going to be our default state when we are not in any combat. Second one here is going to be melee. And the third one here is going to be range. Now one thing I just also want to point out, I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole because you could realistically create an endless list of enumerations based off of how complex your combat system is. However, you would, if you were wanting to set up multiple different types of melee combat as well as multiple different types of ranged combat, all you would really need to do is set up a third enumeration for melee combat types and range combat types and then follow the same principles, because however dynamic your combat system is, creating enumerations that will allow you to be able to control the flow based off of whichever one is currently active is going to allow you to be able to create a much more fluid system. But with these 3 made up here, since this is all we need, we're going to go ahead and save and close this, and now we're going to talk about adding weapons to the AI. Now realistically, to add weapons to them, you need 2 main parts. The first part is the obvious one, which is the models. Now the next part is the sockets or places where the weapons can sit on the character. And the socket system within Unreal Engine is actually really good. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for the mesh. So under character assets here, I have a mesh folder, and we're going to look for just the skeleton. However, if you are not sure where the skeleton is in your mess of folders, because I have this problem myself sometimes, if you know where your blueprint is for your AI, you can just go to this blueprint, open it up. Now, if you don't have any code in there, this might happen. So you just got to click on open full blueprint editor, and it will open up the standard blueprint. Click on the mesh, and then we can use this to find that mesh by clicking on the little folder icon with the magnifying glass. This way it'll bring us to this same location. Now let's say your mesh and your skeleton are not in the same location. You can double click, open up your mesh, and you actually get access to a bunch of things up here. The skeletal mesh, the skeleton itself, an animation previewer, as well as the animation blueprint. So this is one that I like to have up a lot because this gives me access to a ton of different types of information that I'm going to need. So for right now, we'll go ahead and click on the skeleton. This way we can start adding in our sockets. Now on the skeleton tree, when you're adding in sockets, we're going to add in the melee weapon first, which is going to be the sword. As far as where you position the socket, it's going to really depend on what your animation is. So for me, my animation is my character is going to grab the sword from his hip. It's going to grab it with his right hand, and he's going to pull it outwards. So for me, that makes me know that I want to probably have my sword to be sitting on the hips, but the hips is never a good place to actually put anything. So we're going to instead look for spine, and we're going to look for the spine that's closest to the hips. So for me, this is one just labeled as spine. So we can just right click on this, add a socket, and then we'll double click it to rename it, or you can also press F2, and we're going to name this to sword hip. Now, once you have that named, we're also going to go and look for the hand because we're also going to want to have a position for our sword to go when he's actually drawing it. So I'm going to look for the right hand, right click, add a socket, and this one I'm just going to name sword hand. And now if I go up to the search bar here, I can just type in sword, and this way I have both of these sockets right here. And we'll start with the sword hip. So the easiest way to do this is we're going to right click on the sword hip, go to add preview asset, and we're just going to type in sword, and I'm going to add the knight sword that I have. This is also something you can acquire from the Artificial Entertainment Patreon if you guys are interested. So for $5 a month, you can get access to this plus the complete version of this AI combat system, so just throwing that out there. But once we have our sword added in place, shameless promotion aside, we're just going to go ahead and move it aside. And this way we can kind of rotate it and give it a rough position for where it's going to be, but we can fine tune this in just a moment. Once we give it its rough position, we're going to go ahead and go up to where it says the preview scene here, under animation. Under preview controller, we're going to change this from default to use specific animation. And then now we have an animation option here that we can use the drop down, type in sword, and you can see that now I have the sheathing sword and the withdrawing sword. So I'm going to go ahead and choose withdrawing sword. And then we're going to look, kind of scrub through right about where he grabs the sword, and looks like right about here. So it looks like our sword's rotation is a little too heavy. So this is where you want to just kind of play around with it until it feels proper. So for me, I can just kind of rotate this a little bit. You can also turn the snapping off for rotation. Sometimes this does make things a little easier. But as you can see now that just by changing the rotation, his hand position is now matching better with the overall sword. And it doesn't have to be perfect because there is going to be a point where the sword is going to actually be attached to the hand. And that's what we're going to work on now. So if we go to sword hand, right click, and we want to remove all attached assets. So this way we don't have to worry about the sword on the hip getting in our way. And then we'll add preview asset onto the sword hand and just re-add the sword. So now what we can do is we can scrub through to the very end, look at where he's going to have his sword outwards. And now what we can do is we're going to take this and position this into his hand. Now, one thing I will recommend is before moving it, like you just saw me do, rotate it first. Just because usually the pivot point is going to be on the hand, and this just helps keep it in a good position. So that way you don't have to go and kind of like realign it heavily. As you can see here, the sword's pretty much in his hand. So what we can do, now another thing to keep in mind with melee weapons, this is just sort of like a realism look and to help with animations. The blade of the sword usually always is aligned with the knuckles. So like the front of the knuckles should always be aligned as best as you can get it with the blade of the sword. So now that we have that position, we can go ahead and save, and there we go. Now we have our two sockets. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add the sockets for the rifle now. Now, and again, however many weapons you're going to have, you're going to need to make sockets for this. Now, one thing I will say is that if your weapons that you're using have the same origin location and rotation and scale, you can a lot of times use this same socket. However, something to keep in mind is that it is a lot easier just to create multiple sockets because it doesn't create any sort of system load time. It does make your hierarchy a little confusing if you get too deep on it, but sometimes it is better just to add additional sockets rather than trying to mess with the rotation of a bunch of different weapons. So we're going to look for spine again because we're going to add our weapon to our back. But this time I'm going to look for a spine that's a little higher up. So spine 1 is probably going to work better for what I'm trying to do. Maybe even spine 2. But what we're going to do is right click, and we're going to remove all attached assets, right click it again, add preview asset, and this time we're going to add the assault rifle, but we actually need to make our socket first. Almost didn't do that. So this is where I can sometimes get ahead of myself, and I apologize. I'm not going to cut this out because I found it amusing. You guys might too. So we're going to right click on spine 2, and we're going to click on add socket. This one's going to be rifle back. Now we're going to go and search for the right hand again. Once we find it, we're going to click on it, right click, add socket, and this one's going to be rifle hand. And now what we can do is we can just type in rifle, and you'll see we got rifle hand and rifle back, just like what we did on the last one. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change the withdrawing sword animation to a rifle, because this is going to allow us to be able to now position the rifle however we need it. So the rifle back, we're going to right click, go to add preview asset, and add assault rifle A, and we'll start moving it around. Now one thing I like to do is I like to rotate it obviously so that way it's more flush with the back, but I like to put the butt of the weapon, so the stock, really like facing downwards rather than the barrel. And the reason being is because a lot of animations for weapons have the character grabbing from the bottom side. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever fired a weapon before, but if you fire your weapon, put it on your back, and then try to grab the barrel, you're going to burn your hand. So for realism's sake, I like to put the stock of the weapon more to where he's going to be grabbing, or even if I can, even better, put the grip right there. So it's really all about positioning, and keep in mind some real world applications of it, and you'll actually find that these little details can actually make a big difference in how everything looks overall. Because now if I scrub forward a little bit, you'll see it looks like he's kind of grabbing the stock of the weapon or even the grip. I could push this down a little bit and have it make it so that way he's grabbing more of the grip area. But realistically, that's good enough. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. So now we can go rifle hand. And for this one, we're going to change it to the firing rifle, because with rifles or ranged weapons in general, the position of the rifle is a lot of times what you're going to use to be able to do a line trace for damage detection. So if you can make this rifle aligned as best you can with whatever the firing position is going to be, it's going to make your life a lot easier down the road. So what I like to do is use my firing animation as my reference, and then go ahead to the rifle hand, remove all attached assets first, and then add the asset back in. And this way we can go ahead and start doing some, rotation and changes and stuff. Now, I will say the weapons for the rifle, if you're using, I'm using Mixamo, so, these character animations are free, but they're not the greatest. So you might need to do some adjustments. I'm not going to do any adjustments on these because, well, I don't really have time to do animation adjustments like that. So right now, we're just going to kind of keep it like this. Good enough. He looks like he's aiming it. He's probably not going to be rotated to us properly, but that's good enough. So now we have our sockets in place. We can go ahead and go back to our AI character blueprint here, which I still have open for when we showed you how to find the mesh. And we're going to click on the mesh here, go up to add, and we're going to add a static mesh, and then we're going to add a skeletal mesh. Now the static mesh, we're going to Control D to duplicate it, and then we're going to name the first one sword, and then the second one's going to be sheath. Now, if you're using the sword and sheath pack from the Knight Sword set, but if you're just using a standard sword with no sheath, don't add the secondary socket. This is only just because I'm showing you guys how to use the assets that are in the library, or if you have sword and sheath combos. And realistically, in my opinion, those are always the best. But then for the skeletal mesh here, we're just going to rename this to rifle. And this way we now have references to all of the weapons on our character. So we're just going to start adding them in one at a time. So we're going to click on sword, go to static mesh, type in sword, and then click on Knight Sword. Now we're going to go into sheath, scale it static mesh here, and then type in sheath. Look for Knight Sword sheath. Go to rifle, skeletal mesh here, and as you can see, rifle or assault rifle A is right there. Now by default, they all got added to the bottom of the character, but we can change this very easily. So we'll start with the rifle here, and then as you can see under sockets, under the details panel here, we have a parent socket that we can select. So if I go and I select rifle back, you'll now see that the rifle has now been added to his back. If I go to sheath and then use the sword hip and then go to sword and do the same thing here, you can now see that the sword is inside the sheath and the rifle is on the back. Now, the only reason why the sword and sheath locations work like this is because when I modeled and made them, I made sure their origin points were going to be aligned to sit with each other. So this might not be as easy for you depending on how your models are set up, but as long as your origin points for these two are actually lined up appropriately inside of the software that you're using to make them, you can actually very easily apply certain changes. So now that we have this in place here, we now have our ability to start doing different things because now we have a weapon of two different types. So now what we need to do is create the code for our AI to actually go ahead and do everything. So this is where things start to be able to get a little bit cool, because what we're going to do is we're going to use custom events to actually set up our code for drawing our rifle and our sword. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click, search for custom event, and then we're going to name this one draw melee weapon. And then we're going to right click, do another custom event, and this one's going to be draw ranged weapon. Now what these are the custom events that are actually going to fire off. So if you have multiple weapon types and you're going to switch in between them, use custom events instead, and then use one custom event to call them all back, which is what we're going to be setting up here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to give these a little bit of space, but we're going to pull off of the draw melee weapon here, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to go play montage, and we're going to click on the play and a montage. We're going to use the simplistic ones on these. Now the montage we want to select, we actually have to make, but that's fine because we're just going to add these in first. So we can actually just highlight and then Control D to duplicate that in a montage, and there we go. Now what we want to do though is whenever we're drawing our weapons, one trick that I like to do is use animations, so if you have your AI running at the character when they're in combat, have that running speed be consistent across multiple different types of melee or ranged weapon types. And the reason being is because we could take the character movement, pull off of it, get max walk speed, or set max walk speed. So we'll click on the setter here, and we can plug both of these into the set max walk speed. And the reason why this is nice is because if you're using the same speed, you can just go and, let's say set max walk speed to 350, something that's just like a jogging speed. And then you can do the same thing when you're doing the stow code as well. Now, one thing I like to do for this is just take all of this, highlight it, Control D, and then we're just going to rename and change a few things up. So like this custom event's going to be stow melee weapon. This one's going to be stow ranged weapon. And then this speed is going to be set to 175. So this is going to be kind of like when everything goes back to normal. Now again, we do need the montages to play though, so we'll go ahead and create those really quickly. And if you guys don't know, I'll show you really quick how to be able to make montages. So I have here the animations folder here, and the ones that we're going to need are going to be the withdrawing sword, sheathing sword, put rifle back, grab rifle from back, and firing rifle. So we're going to take these, highlight all of this. So this is just by holding Control, I can select multiple, and then I can go to create and a montage. Now another thing I like to do is to just go new folder, montages, and then we'll just go ahead and we'll put all these newly created montages into their own folder, so this way we can easily go back and reference them later, rather than just having all of their animations and the montages being in the same folder. It's just a way to access things a little more cleanly. So now that we have our montages though, we can go back to our AI character blueprint here, and for the draw melee weapon, we'll go ahead and select on withdrawing sword. On the draw ranged weapon, we'll go ahead and grab rifle from back, and then the stow melee weapon is going to be sheathing sword, and then the stow ranged weapon is going to be put back rifle. So now that we have these set up here, what we're going to need to do is create the main code that's actually going to call all of these. Because again, these custom events can be called any way that we want them to. So we can actually go and create one more custom event. So we're going to right click and go custom event. And then we're going to name this weapon check. Because ultimately we only want to have one task that we're going to use to be able to call whatever weapon we need. So this is an easy way to be able to create this by just having the custom events being called into here and then recalling them off of one single event that we can call in the behavior tree. Now that might be a little confusing for those of you who haven't messed around with this very much, but don't worry, I'm going to show you how to do all of this. So off of the weapon check here, we're going to need to get some information. So the first thing we're going to do off of this is we're going to pull off and we're going to type in switch combat, and we're going to switch on combat state enum. Now the selection we're going to use is actually going to be the combat state enum that is going to be within the behavior tree itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go quickly add this to our Blackboard, so this way we can call this within our blueprint. So we're going to go back to our AI character, AI assets, and we're going to go to our main assets. So I did move things around. I put all of our behavior trees inside of one folder. That's another thing that I did do. So there's nothing's changed. It's all the same stuff. But we're going to go ahead and open up the Blackboard here, and we're going to make a new Blackboard key. So we're going to go plus new key, and then we're going to click on enum. We're going to name this combat state. And then we're going to go to the key type, go to the Blackboard details panel, and we're just going to select that enum that we made. So that's going to be the combat state enum. And then we can click on save, and then we're going to go back to our AI character. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click and get Blackboard. So under AI, get Blackboard. We're going to pull this back, and we're going to get value as enum. So we're going to get value as enum, and then the key name we're going to pull off and make literal name. And now we're just going to put the combat state as the name. This has to match exactly with what's up here. So if you need to, you can always just highlight, copy, paste, go back to the blueprint, and then just make sure with Control V, and that way it's accurate. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is that this return value is going to be a byte. This isn't going to actually return back the actual combat state. So when you plug this in, it's going to do this, and that's exactly what should happen because it's going byte to enum. And this is basically how it converts from whatever is in the behavior tree and then allows it to switch. So this way it's going to use whatever you set in the behavior tree as the switcher here versus having to set melee and combat and range combat from within the actual blueprint. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of checks off of melee and range. So we're going to be and left click twice. So this way we can get two different branches here, and we're going to pull on melee and then into ranged. Now we also need two variables. So we're going to go back to our blueprint, and we're going to go plus on the variable twice here. And we do need them as booleans, so we can keep them as booleans, but we're going to rename this one to melee combat. And we're going to rename this one to ranged combat. Now, these are more just simple variables that we can use for the animation blueprint more than anything, so don't worry too much about this. But these are just, again, so that way we can have different states for melee and range combat. So we're going to get the getter nodes for both of these, but we're going to put their opposites underneath each other. So basically, if our enum and our behavior tree is set to, let's say, melee, because, the behavior tree is going to be essentially where all the functioning information is going to come from. If we're in melee, but our range combat boolean, again, for our enum graph is set to true, then what we're going to want to do is stow ranged weapon. And we'll pull it up a little bit. And then usually what I like to do is put a slight delay off of the end. So whatever the animation is going to be, usually about a second is okay. Because I find that realistically with AI, you want to speed up some of the animation actions because you don't want it to be too delayed. You want it to be more of an instantaneous reaction as best you can while still maintaining some fluidity. But you can play around with this delay to whatever works well for you, depending on the length of animations that you have for your draw and stow animations. However, if this is false, what we're going to do is we're going to draw melee weapon. Now we're also going to take off of completed and plug this in here as well. So this way it'll go through if we are in a range combat. So this is more like if we're in range combat and then it detects that we need to go into melee combat, it's going to go ahead, stow the ranged weapon first, delay for a moment before trying to draw the melee weapon, and this way it just gives it a buffer time to be able to put the weapon back and attach a new weapon to its hand. Now for the range, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to hook up melee combat as the condition. If that's true, we're going to stow melee weapon, pull off of here, run a delay, set this to 1 second, and then we can go ahead, pull this up here. Off of false, we can draw melee weapon, just like this. So we'll plug this in off of completed, and there we go. Now we have our weapon check. So what we can do is we can use this and call this to be able to actually choose which weapon is going to be drawn, and then these down here are actually going to be the drawing animations that are going to be played. So this again helps make it so that way things are a little bit more localized to, the actual code sections and the actual play animation sections. So now there is one more thing that we're going to need to create in here, and this is going to be a reset, sort of like a reset back to patrol. So we're going to go custom event one more time, and we're going to go reset to, we'll just go reset combat. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and we're just going to copy it so we don't have to redo it again. So we're just going to take it, highlight it, Control D, and then we're going to hook the reset combat right into here like so. So this way we can go ahead, if melee is true, stow melee weapon. If ranged is true, stow ranged weapon. Because this is going to be resetting combat. So we're not going to be going from ranged weapon to melee weapon. We're actually going to be going from ranged weapon and then back into a more patrol state. Now, the other thing we want to make sure to do is set both of our values for melee combat and range combat to false. Now, I like to just set these both off at the end, so we're just going to grab them, hold Alt, get the setter nodes, and we'll plug both of these into the setter here, just like so. Pull it back, and then we're going to run a delay off of here at the end, just again, so that way we don't run into any sort of issues with it firing off too quickly. So once this is set the duration to 0, so once you set the duration to 1 or whatever works, again, the duration of the delays you might have to play around with because this is all going to be based off of your animation timing. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you might just have to play around, but just with the delays. Everything else should work just fine. Now after the delay though, now what we're going to do is we're going to get the Blackboard again, pull it back here, and this time we're going to set value as enum. Off of the key name, we're going to go and name it combat state. And then off of the key name, we're going to go make literal name, just like so. And then off of completed here, plug this in. And then the make literal name, we'll take this from none to combat state. And then we're going to take this, we'll highlight it, duplicate it, because we're going to need it again, because we're going to change our combat state and our base state. So our base state is also going to be set to 0, so we can keep that enum value as 0, and just type in base state. Now, one thing to keep in mind with enumerations is that if we pull this up here, if we look at the enumeration here for the combat state, you'll see none, melee, ranged. This is technically 0, 1, and 2. So whatever you set that as is going to, like on the enumeration set here, set value as enum. What this is going to do is actually set, if you set it to 0, it's going to set it to the absolute top 1. So if you change none and add something else in here, it's actually going to set it to that. So just keep that in mind, that the numerical value is from top to bottom. So now that we have our code for drawing our melee weapon, there's one more thing we need to do as far as giving him the ability to draw everything. And that's going to be to add what are referred to as Enum notifies. Enum notifies allow you to be able to actually utilize an attachment component and use animation timing for the execution. Now, what I mean by this is if we go and open up our montages, so we're going to go into our AI character, character assets, and animation, open up that montages folder. Now, we're going to open up the sheathing sword montage first. Now, you'll see we have a track here that's called notifies. If we right click where it says 1, we can add a new notify to be able to call and do something. So if we look, for example, we'll actually get the drawing sword animation. So if I go to wherever the character is actually going to be grabbing it, which is going to be, I'd say, right about here, I can go to notifies, right click, add notify, and then click on new notify, grab sword. And this will add this into the animation. I can click on save, go to the asset browser, and this way I can start working with the rest of the montages. So we can go to sheathing sword here and do the same thing, but basically in reverse. Like, just look at wherever he's fully put back the sword, which is going to be probably right about here. Do the same thing on the notifies, right click, add notify, new notify, and stow sword. And then now we can do the same thing for the rifle, so grab rifle from back. So it's going to be right about here at about frame 30. Right click on the notifies, add notify, new notify, and grab rifle. And then we can go to the next one here, put back rifle, look at where his hand is kind of at the full position, notifies, new notify, and then stow rifle. So now that our notifies are made, we can save all of these, and we're going to open up the animation blueprint. Now, we can actually do this by clicking the little 3 icon option here at the top. And then we're going to want to go to the event graph here, and we're going to add a few things in. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to right click, and we're going to look for stow, and now you can see that event Enum notifies stow rifle and stow sword are now events that we can use to be able to call certain functions off of. So we'll call the stow sword, and then we'll also call stow rifle, and then we're also going to call the grab rifle and sword animation notifies as well. So with all of these, what we can do is actually have it attached to the character's hand utilizing the sockets that we made earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull off and we're going to do stow and grab sort of together, but we're going to keep them individually separate. So what we're going to do is off of the stow rifle, we're going to pull off and we're going to attach. Actually, no, there's an easier way to do this. So we're going to go down to the component section for the blueprint and we're going to grab the as AI character BP. So this is your character reference, and you're going to want to get the getter node by holding control and dragging it into your screen. Now you can also just duplicate this because you're going to need one of these for both. Now off of this we can pull off and then do attach component to component, and you're going to see rifle and sword as an option. So we can go attach component to component rifle, and then just kind of move it around a little bit, and then attach component to component sword, move this down a little bit, and just kind of move it around until it's cleaned up to something you like. Also going to turn that no debug object selected on. And then what we can do is just plug these execution pins in here, just like so. Now we are going to have to change some transition rules, but that's totally fine. Now, as you can see here, we have a target and a parent socket. So we're going to need to also, from the as a character BP, we're going to type in mesh so we can get the mesh itself, and we're going to set this as the parent for both of these. Now, you can also call individual references if this is a little too messy for you, but I'm just trying to show you guys the base principles. So, now what we're going to do for the socket name, though, is we need to get our skeleton. So, we're going to go to our skeleton, and we're going to search for sword, and we're going to get the sword hip, and we're going to Control-C, go back to the animation blueprint, and we're going to set this to the socket name for stow sword. And then for stow rifle, we can go back to our skeleton, search for rifle, get the rifle back, Control-C, and go back to the animation blueprint and change it from none to rifle back. Now you're also going to want to make sure to set the location rules, make sure these are all set to snap to target. So we're going to go ahead and just select these. So we're going to just all of them on the drop down, snap to target. Because now what we can do is we can just highlight this, and if you hold Control and then highlight over these, it'll actually deselect, and we can just actually take this and Control-D to duplicate it, and now we have a copy of it. So we actually don't need the second one here. So now what we'll do is we're going to plug these in here like so, and the only thing we need to change is actually going to be the socket names. So both of these are going to be rifle and sword hand, so I can just search hand, you'll see sword hand, rifle hand. So I can go back to my main animation blueprint, sword, and just type in rifle, hand. Then again, you can always copy and paste these as well, but they're simple enough that I can just type them in manually. So now we have rifle hand and sword hand. So whenever we call these, this is where it's going to go and attach it to that socket. So this is where the power of Enum notifies are awesome, because it allows you to be able to attach things to a character based off of whatever you need. Now this principle doesn't just apply to attaching weapons. You can also use this to attach things like world items, like have a character drink, eat, do other types of things. Enum notifies are basically the powerful way to be able to attach things to a character at the point of your choosing. So now there's two more things that I want to cover before we close out this video and then go into the next one where we're going to be putting it all together. So the first things that we're going to need to do is, now that we've created the code for things, we're going to start creating tasks. Now, one thing I talked a little bit about in the last video was you can use tasks to be able to call custom events from inside a blueprint so long as you have a proper casting function. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our AI character assets, go into the behavior trees here, and we're going to open up the main AI BT just so that way we can get access to new tasks and new decorators versus having to go through the whole blueprint creation process. So what we're going to do is go to new task, and we're going to go BT task blueprint base. And the first one we're going to do is going to be base state selector. Because what we're going to be creating here is essentially going to be the ability to choose from our base states. So we're going to create a few different tasks here to be able to make it so that way we can actually determine what state we're going to be in. So the functions here, we're going to go into the overrides and then receive execute AI. Now what we're going to do is go to the variables, new variable, and we're going to call this base state underscore enum, and then go to the boolean drop down here and then look for our base state enum. Now once that's added in, we can go ahead and we're going to get the setter node for this. So we're going to want to take this, drag it in, and then with alt we can get the setter and then hook these up. Now what we also want to do is get the ability to change what this setter node is going to be within the behavior tree. So what we can do is actually right click on the input here, promote it to a variable, and then we're going to call it base state selector, and then we can pull this back a little bit. And then off of this, we're going to set value as enum. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plug the enum right into the value here. And the key, we're going to pull off promote to variable, Blackboard key, or BB key for short. And then what we're going to do is make Blackboard key and the base state selector, we're going to make both of these public. So this way we can edit these within inside of the behavior tree. Now, off of the Blackboard value is enum, we're just going to pull off of here and just do a finish execute, so that way it knows that once all this is completed, we are done with this task and we can move on to the next thing. So with this, we can go ahead and compile and save. So now we're going to go back to our behavior tree here, and we're going to make another task. So I'm going to go up to new task, BT task blueprint base, and this one is going to be the weapon check. So we're just going to type in weapon check, and then we're going to go to functions, override, receive execute AI. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to cast to our AI character. So cast to main AI. And then what we're going to do off of here is we're going to pull off the execution pin and cast to AI character BP. And then the object we're going to plug into the controlled pawn. So from here, we can pull off of this and we can type in weapon check. And then off of weapon check here, we're just going to go with a finish execute. Now you can also add a delay function in here as well if you wanted to make it so it didn't go right off after just firing off this code, but you don't really have to. But it is something that I've done a couple of times just to be able to help create more fluidity. So if you find some issues with the way that the weapon check is operating and then functioning off to the next item within the behavior tree, sometimes the delay does work. So just something to keep in mind. Now the last task that we're going to need to make is going to be the reset. So this is going to be the thing that actually allows us to go back to a patrol state if we are in a combat state, and that's the last bit of code that we made. So we can go back, BT task blueprint base, and reset to patrol. Then again, functions, override, receive execute AI. Now, just a quick understanding as to why I like this one is because it gives you the owner controller and the controlled pawn reference. And these are awesome because realistically it means that you can reference the blueprint or the controller right from its own internal variables. So this is something that allows you to be able to really uniquely create AI that can be spawned around by using one of these rather than getting a direct actor reference. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull off and we're going to cast to AI character blueprint. And then again, object being put into the controlled pawn, AI character BP, call the function of reset combat, and then finish execute. And again, always make sure to click on success, and then we'll compile and save. Now, you might want to make sure that all those tasks go into the proper folder. I think by default, all of mine went into a different folder. Let's see. Yep, so all of them went into the behavior tree folder. So I'm just going to take all of these, control selecting them, and move them into their appropriate folder of tasks. So those are all the main tasks that we're going to need. Now, there are individual tasks that are going to be specific to using a rifle or using a certain type of melee weapon. So we're going to cover those in the next video. So the last thing we're going to do is create the basic structure on our combat behavior tree now that we have everything together. And this way we can roll right into creating the melee and combat branches. So we're going to go open up our AI character, AI assets, and we're going to open up the combat behavior tree that we made in the last video. And if you didn't make that, it's very easy. You can just go right click, artificial intelligence, and click on behavior tree, name it combat main BT. And as you can see, all we have is a selector and a weight. So I'm going to take off the weight function, and we're going to add in some code. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull off of this selector, and we're going to look for that base state selector task that we made. And we're going to make sure that we set it to combat, and we set that combat state to be from base state. So we're basically setting base states to combat. And then off of the selector here, we're going to run another selector. Here, we're going to add a decorator conditional loop. And this one is going to be if combat state is equal to, this one's going to be if base state is equal to combat. So this way it'll run this over and over again. And then we're going to right click, add decorator, and we're going to go to a cooldown. And this is just to make it so that way, once it's done, it's done. We just need to set it to 0.2 because it's immediately going to fire off and run this event. And because base states is equal to combat, it's going to run this over and over and over and over again. Now from here is going to be where we end up running the additional branches for the behaviors. So we can go to a selector here, type in selector again, and then type in selector on this side. So what we'll do is we'll name this. So this is going to be combat set / choose type. And this one is going to be choose combat type. And we'll go with this selector will just be melee. And this one is going to be range. Now we're going to set up an EQS query, a couple of queries actually, in the next video that are going to allow us to be able to determine whether or not ranged or melee combat is going to be utilized. But realistically from here, now what we've done is created the ability for our AI to detect our character. So we've got this over here. Once that is true, it's going to go into the combat behavior tree. It's going to conditional loop a player is set in that area, and then it's going to conditional loop this part of it if the base state is equal to combat. Now from here, we were just going to pull off of melee and we'll just go run behavior. And we're going to do this on both because we're actually going to make the melee and ranged systems their own individual behaviors. But again, we're going to be doing this in the next video. This is just purely the setup. So that way I can show you guys, kind of what the structure is. Because once this runs, this is going to basically run these two over and over again. And then again, based off of the distance query that we're going to set up in the next video, it'll allow us to be able to swap between the two types of behaviors. So that's going to do it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that you found this informative. In the next one, we're going to go in and start setting up the two different behavior types, so I hope you're excited. I know I am, and as always, stay animated.